Hey everyone, my name's Dom, welcome to the channel. Today's video is going to be something a little bit different. You can see I'm in a different location if you're familiar with the channel. That's because I'm going to be using a computer today to show you my rating scale that I use when I'm reviewing books. I'm also going to take a look at the Hall of Fame so you can have a look at all of the books that I've put on here in the last nearly 10 years that I've been using this system. So today I won't be looking at a particular book in any detail, but I'll make up for it by talking about a whole lot of books in the second half of the video. So since I started using my weighted rating scale for reviewing books on my channel, I've had a lot of questions about the rating scale that I use, how it works, how I chose those weightings, loads of different questions, but also people who've been interested in the full Hall of Fame because I only show a snapshot of it each time I review a book. So today we're going to answer some of those questions, take a look at the weighted rating scale and a look through the books that I've put on that Hall of Fame. So first of all, some of the very basic details. The first book that I ever rated using this scheme was Malice back in February 2013. Since then, almost every book that I have read has gone on to this scale. Now, there are a few exceptions to that. I don't tend to rate novellas or short story collections within this scheme because they're very different and it would be unfair to them. There are a couple in my Hall of Fame before I made this decision, so I'll point those out. There's also a period of time I had a few years ago when I was in a reading slump and I came out of it and was reading a lot of sci-fi, and for most of the books I read for those couple of years I was in a different headspace. I didn't track them on the Hall of Fame, so there's a chunk of nearly 50 books that I read during that period that don't appear on here as well. Mostly sci-fi, Star Wars, Galaxy's Edge titles and a few others. And then there's also some audiobooks that I read this year as I was testing out whether that format was for me, and I didn't include most of those on this list either. So when I put together this weighted rating scale, it was because I wanted a way that I could record my thoughts on books and I could easily compare books against each other even as time went by, and to get a more accurate, for me, kind of rating scale rather than just a standard 5 or 10 star or whatever other options were available. So if you've seen the rating scale that I use, it is very similar to the core pile system that a lot of people use, and many of the elements are the same as those elements in core pile. However, with my rating scale, I took a decision over what elements I wanted to include and how important to me they were. So let's have a look at it in more detail and have a look at how it works. First of all, I've got my 4 main components of my rating scale: enjoyment, world, characters and plot, all of which I rate out of 20. The writing style I rate out of 10. The pacing of the book I rate out of 5, and then I've got a discretionary section which I also rate out of 5. Once all of those have been filled in on my spreadsheet, it gives me a score and it gives me a rank for the book within all of the titles that I've already rated. So you can see on here those figures, if you get a maximum, those figures will add up to 100, which conveniently gives me a percentage rating without having to do any fudging to get it to 100. So why did I choose those particular factors? So the first 4 on this list, for me, those are the key factors, the most important things, the things that if you get wrong will have the biggest impact on my overall feeling about a book. The writing style is also very important to me, so that one I rate out of 10. The pacing, there's not so much movement for me. It is important, but I don't feel that there's a lot of difference that you can have. So that one I've only got 5 little markers that I can choose between. So then those factors added up nicely to 95, which left me 5 points or 5% to play with. And I wanted a little extra that I could just tip in myself into the book score. So I included here a discretionary section as well, which would allow me to add in those additional points. And I would normally use these for one of a handful of things. If a book's got a really nice cover, if a book's got a nice map included, if there's some additional artwork, if there are additional extras within the book, whether that's a glossary, character list, previously on to refresh you with the previous books in the series. Some books will then have other additional extras as well, which all help to improve the experience of reading the book. So I include those in scores here. The other thing that I sometimes include within this section is more of a gut feeling element, and that's normally reserved for a book that holds a special place in my heart. So as we get further and further through a series, they tend to hold a little bit more kind of importance, if you like, in my heart. So if it's book 4, 5, 6 in a series that I'm really enjoying, I'm going to feel more attached to that book, and that generally gets tipped in with a bonus point in the discretionary section as well. So in terms of rating within those 7 different categories, the discretionary therefore is quite easy because there are certain elements that I tend to look for there. For all of the others, it does come down to my kind of gut feeling, I suppose, when I've read the book. For the first 4 categories out of 20, I will generally tend to go with 15 being pretty good, but not great. Anything above that is generally good. Anything below that is slipping in towards the not so good for me. So a basic score would be 15 in each of those sections. For the writing style, this one is quite easy, but it is also quite important, which is why it's weighted more heavily than the pacing for me. This one I'll generally go with 6 or 7 for some pretty good but not outstanding writing style. If I'm really enjoying, I'm really on board with the way an author writes, then it'll get more towards the 8s, 9s, potentially 10s. For the pacing, generally speaking, middle of the road is 3. 3 is good, 4 is really good, 5 is difficult to get, but that is what I would call basically perfect pacing. And then the discretionary, as I've said, is a lot easier for me to figure out what score to go for. So for an average there, that would score 74%, which is absolutely middle of the road. That is actually the average score, as it happens, on my Hall of Fame at the moment. And that average score of 74% would rank this particular made-up book at 42nd in the list, which again is roughly in the middle of all the titles that I've got on there at the moment. So that's a bit of an overview of the actual rating scale itself and how I score my books. Let's have a look at the Hall of Fame and check out the titles that I've got on there at the moment. So as I said, I've been using this for nearly 10 years, with a couple of years in between where I didn't update it, and various titles that I have missed out because they are audiobooks, short stories, novellas, although all of those do have items that are included on here, which I added before I made the decision not to include them. So I didn't want to skew things, and towards the bottom of my list there will be therefore some titles which I consider unfairly rated, but I've left them on there because I've added them and I'm not going to remove things once I've added them. The other thing to note on here, a couple of things that I find interesting. One is that I rate all of these books pretty much when I've finished, so everything's fresh and I don't change these ratings at all once I've added them. So sometimes I'll rate a book and I'll really enjoy it and I find that it is below a book that I enjoyed less, but I suppose there's a recency bias with that because it's fresher in my mind and the other one might have faded a little bit. The other thing that I find quite interesting sometimes is the difference between my personal thoughts on the book overall, so my gut feeling 5 stars that I will rate out of on Goodreads and other similar sites, and then the percentage score using the weighted scale. So sometimes I will not like a book, but it's got some really good elements in it despite my overall feeling, so it can rate a bit higher on this scale because it's as much as possible what I see as a fair way of rating the books. So with that said, let's take a look from bottom to top of my Hall of Fame. So on here at the moment, with all of those factors said, I have 85 titles right now, starting right at the bottom of this list, and the lowest rated title that I have on here scored 43%. I'm not going to go into all of the individual elements that made up these particular scores as well, because I don't feel like we need to go into that kind of granular detail here. But the book that I've got taking up the bottom place, as I say, scores 43%, and that ranks it at number 85. And this is one of the titles that I think is unfair because it doesn't stack up against the other books, because it's a novella, and that is The Slow Regard of Silent Things by Patrick Rothfuss. The next couple of books, there's again some titles that I think are unfair on there, and appearing at the bottom of the list, maybe that shows how unfair it is to compare them against the other books. So next up I've got The Grim Company by Luke Scull, which I actually DNF'd. I did not finish this book, but for whatever reason at the time I gave it a rating, so it appears on here. That scored 48%. We then got The Legend of Drizzt by R.A. Salvatore, a couple of places up with 53%, which is a collection of short stories. So again, those three titles so far, I feel it's unfair really to compare those to the other titles on this list. If you were to remove those, the bottom two titles here would be The City by Stella Gemmell, which I just did not enjoy very much at all. I found it very slow and dull, and that scored just above 50%. And then a few percentage points above that, we've got Prince of Thorns by Mark Lawrence, a book which I really did not enjoy, but still came out with a score of 57%. Okay, so to the next batch of 10 on my Hall of Fame, we start off with Simon R. Green's Once in a Blue Moon, which I loved the originals in this series. They're some of the books that I grew up with, Blue Moon Rising being one of my gateways to fantasy, but this book just did not do it for me. The Red Knight by Miles Cameron, I did not enjoy. I've spoken about it a couple of times. There's a number of reasons why I did not enjoy this book, but despite my particular thoughts on the book, ranking in 78th on my list, it still scored a respectable 61%. We then have a few books that I actually read quite recently: Scions of Shannara, The Thunder Heist, Poppy War, The Last Watch and Seven Deaths of an Empire. I read all of those in 2021. The First King of Shannara I read towards the end of 2020, so it was a good batch here, which I read recently but haven't done it for me in terms of the scores. Into the next batch of 10, and again we've got some titles that I've read recently. I've got an audiobook on here which I included before deciding not to do so. Two audiobooks in fact, The Broken Eye and Six of Crows. Nolan by Michael J. Sullivan, I did not have a great time with that one. Some more Shannara that I read recently, and then as we get up towards the top 60 on my list, we're getting into 69%. So I think that goes to show that although it might be difficult to get a really high rating, it's actually quite difficult to get a really low rating as well because of the elements that are used in this particular scheme. Moving on to the next batch of 10, we start off with The Dark That Dwells, a self-published sci-fi space opera by Matt Digman and Ryan Roddy. That comes in at 69%. The Maleficent 7, Blood of Heirs, another couple of titles, Among Thieves by MJ Kuhn, again titles that I read this year, and then topping up there with a rank of 47 at 72% is Best Served Cold by Joe Abercrombie, again a title that I've read this year. So there's loads of titles here that I've read this year. We've got some of those titles in the next batch of 10, kicking off with Assassin's Apprentice, which is now down at 47th, equal with Best Served Cold. Spiderlight, nice bit of Adrian Tchaikovsky there at the same point. The Air War, that's book 8 of Shadows of the Apt, also at 47. So we've got 5 titles there tied on 72%. The Copper Promise by Jen Williams being the 5th of those. First book in the second book even in the Lacanius series, An Echo of Things to Come, that came in at 73%. Legend by David Gemmell, also at 73%, equal 44th. Absolutely fantastic classic fantasy title. The Seventh Cadence coming in with a score of 75%, so 3/4 of the full score at 75% is putting that title at 38th on the list. So moving on, and we have another title called Among Thieves by Doug Hulick this time, 75%, equal 38th. Is it the best of the two books on this list called Among Thieves? No, I wouldn't say so, but my rating scale marked after I read the book says that it was a few percent higher than MJ Kuhn's 2021 release. Personally, I would put MJ Kuhn's book above Doug Hulick's, but we go with what the rating scale says. We Ride the Storm by Devin Madsen. I really enjoyed this book, nearly gave it 5 stars, and yet this one came out as 76%, an equal 34th on the rating scale because of some of the individual elements that make up the book, rather than just a gut feeling as to how much I enjoyed it overall. And then we're getting into Threadlight, Voice of War by Zach Argyle. 77% is a really good score, and that is at 31st or equal 31st in my list. And then we're into the top 30 on my list with The Sword of Kaigan by M.L. Wang. Self-published standalone fantasy. I really recommend if you haven't read this. And then even better, a vast amount better than Sword of Kaigan in my estimation, but only 1% better in terms of the rating. 79% is Illborn by Daniel T. Jackson. Sharing equal 26th with The Shadow of the Gods by John Gwynne, so that's some really good company there. Last Argument of Kings and The Black Tongue Thief, so some really good titles around this point. We then move up to equal 21st, and again there's a bunch of titles here. Highlights including Ryan Cahill's Of Blood and Fire. Night Watch is my favourite Discworld novel. Book 4 of The Greatcoats by Sebastian de Castell, and then 2 Adrian Tchaikovsky's at the start and towards the end of the Shadows of the Apt series. Okay, now we're getting into the business end of the table, and we start out at equal 15th, but there's a bunch of titles here, so this is our top 20. And we've still got some self-published titles within this top 20, which is great. There are some great titles out here, and we start out with Book 2 of Threadlight, Stones of Light, with 81%, so a great score there for Zach Argyle. We've then got in between the top 10 and the top 20 the remaining 3 Greatcoats books by Sebastian de Castell, so that shows how much I really enjoyed these. Another John Gwynne title on here, Malice, sits now with 81% at equal 15th. We've got some other great titles in there as well. Bloodsong by Anthony Ryan, Winter Warriors by David Gemmell. I read that a few years ago and just really enjoyed it. It got a really good score. The full trilogy, The Deed of Paxnarium by Elizabeth Moon, also scoring 81%. And then the other 2 titles within this batch of 10, we've got Memory of Light. Book 14 of The Wheel of Time is in 13th on my Hall of Fame with 83%. And then Rhaenyra Revelations Book 2, Rise of Empire by Michael J. Sullivan, which brings us to my top 10 of all the books that I've rated using this scale. Right at the bottom, and the most recent addition to this list, in number 10 with 89%, is Ryan Cahill's The Bound and the Broken Book 2 of Darkness and Light. This top 10 is dominated by John Gwynne as one of my favourite authors, with my favourite series, or kind of 2 series combined. So he is making up most of the names in this list, starting with A Time of Dread in equal 8th, along with Book 10 of The Shadows of the Apt by Adrian Tchaikovsky. I've then got 3 titles scoring 91%. Valor, Book 2 of Faithful and the Fallen, and then we've got the other 2 books of the Rhaenyra Revelation series, Theft of Swords and Heir of Novron. All 3 of those scored 91% and sit in equal 5th on the list. Right at the top of the table we have 4 titles which are tied, 2 in equal 3rd, 2 in equal 1st. First of all is Ruin, Faithful and the Fallen Book 3, and A Time of Blood and Bone Book 2, both by John Gwynne. But ahead of those, and this really goes to show how much better a series can get as we go through the book. I often say when I'm looking at these scores that the further into a series you go, the more the characters, the world, hopefully the storyline develops. So a book that is further into a series theoretically has a higher chance of getting a good score, and that's reflected here because my top titles that I've rated on this particular scheme are both final books in John Gwynne series. We've got A Time of Courage, Book 3 of Blood and Bone, and Book 4 of The Faithful and the Fallen, Wrath. Both scored 95% and take equal 1st on my ratings list. So there you have it. Now it is in the open until the next book goes on there and changes the ranking for at least some of the titles. This is my current, as of the time of filming, Hall of Fame. So that's it anyway. I hope this wasn't too boring for people. I hope some of you at least found it informative. Let me know in the comments what you thought of the rating system, the way it works, the weighting itself, and of course the Hall of Fame. Any surprises, any real shocks as I was going through this. As usual, like and subscribe if you haven't already done so. I hope to see you again soon, but take care of yourselves in the meantime. Read some good books. Bye for now.